Before kings, before empires, before a single word of history was ever written, humanity had already lived through thousands of generations. People crossed unknown landscapes, survived brutal climates, built communities, created rituals, and shaped a world whose stories were never recorded. Most of their lives vanished without names, dates, or written memories, but traces of them still remain beneath our feet. If you love exploring humanity's deepest and most mysterious past, like this video, subscribe to the channel and join us as we journey into the world before recorded history. Long before the first king carved his name into stone, before taxes were counted on clay tablets, before armies marched beneath written banners and priests recorded the movements of the stars, human beings were already living through stories so vast that almost none of them were written down. For most of our existence, history leaves no sentences. There are no chronicles describing a winter that lasted too long, no diary from a hunter watching strange animals cross a frozen plain, no map drawn by families moving along a coastline that now lies beneath the sea. Entire worlds rise, change, and disappear without producing a single surviving written account. The people inside those worlds are not silent because they had nothing to say. They are silent because their words were carried in voices, gestures, memory, ritual, song, and perhaps forms of communication that vanished with the people who used them. What remains is scattered across the ground: stone flakes, burned seeds, butchered bones, footprints hardened in ancient sediment pollen, trapped in mud fragments of DNA, preserved inside teeth and shorelines that no longer touch the shore. This is the enormous landscape before recorded history, a span so long that the civilizations most people think of as ancient occupy only its final edge. Writing appears relatively late in the human story. In Mesopotamia, some of the earliest known writing systems developed during the late 4th millennium BCE, while Egypt produces its own early hieroglyphic tradition around roughly the same broad period. But Homo sapiens has existed for hundreds of thousands of years. Long before scribes begin pressing signs into wet clay, people have already crossed continents, survived ice ages, encountered other kinds of humans, developed complex tools, painted caves, buried their dead, exchanged materials across great distances, adapted to deserts and forests, and watched coastlines move by hundreds of kilometers. Recorded history is therefore not the beginning of the human story. It is the moment when one particular kind of evidence suddenly becomes available. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. To enter the world before writing requires a different way of seeing the past. A historian working with a royal archive may have names, dates, treaties, debts, accusations, and descriptions of events. A prehistorian often begins with something far quieter. A cluster of broken stones beside an extinct river channel may be enough to show that people stopped there. Microscopic scratches on an animal bone can reveal whether flesh was removed with stone tools. Layers of ash can indicate repeated fires inside a shelter. The chemistry locked inside a human tooth may preserve clues about childhood diet or movement between geological regions. Ancient DNA can expose relationships between populations that left no written genealogies and sometimes no recognizable cultural descendants. Even the mud beneath a lake can become a kind of archive, preserving pollen that records forests advancing and retreating as climates shift. These sources are powerful, but they rarely tell complete stories. Archaeology can reveal that something happened while leaving the intentions behind it uncertain. A burial filled with objects might indicate status, affection, ritual, fear, belief, or several of these at once. A settlement abandoned suddenly may point toward drought, conflict, disease, economic breakdown, change in rivers, or a gradual decision that looks sudden only because later erosion erased the transition. Scholars still debate many prehistoric interpretations because the evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness is not a weakness in the field so much as a defining feature of the world being studied. The farther back the timeline extends, the more often certainty dissolves into probabilities, yet the fragments have become far more revealing than they once seemed. During much of modern archaeology's early history, prehistory was often imagined as a slow and simple prelude to civilization, populated by small groups who changed little until agriculture and cities supposedly transformed everything. That picture has steadily broken apart. Excavations and new scientific methods reveal long-distance exchange networks among hunter-gatherers, carefully planned settlements earlier than once expected, sophisticated use of plants and landscapes, repeated symbolic traditions and social systems that may have been considerably more flexible than later historical societies. Prehistoric people do not simply wait for civilization to begin. They experiment continuously with ways of living. One of the strangest details is how much of their world no longer exists at all. During colder periods of the Ice Age, vast quantities of water are locked in glaciers, and global sea levels fall dramatically below their modern position. Continental shelves become broad coastal plains, islands become peninsulas, straits become valleys. Regions now covered by tens of meters of seawater may once have supported rivers, wetlands, hunting grounds, migration routes, and settlements. When the climate warms and ice melts, these landscapes disappear beneath rising seas. The archaeological record we see on land is therefore biased from the beginning. Many of the places most attractive to prehistoric communities, especially productive coastlines and river mouths, may now lie offshore. The same distortion happens through erosion, glaciation, tectonic activity, changing rivers, vegetation, and simple decay. Wood disappears, leather rots, fiber baskets vanish. Human bodies are often destroyed completely. Stone survives unusually well, which means stone tools dominate our image of deep prehistory, even though prehistoric technology must have depended heavily on materials that rarely preserve. A spear shaft, cordage-woven container hide garment, wooden digging stick, or plant fiber net may have been as important as any stone blade, but thousands of years later it is usually the stone that remains. The past is filtered by chemistry before archaeologists ever reach it. Occasionally, however, conditions preserve something astonishingly intimate. Footprints survive at scattered prehistoric sites across the world, freezing moments that would otherwise be invisible. They record individuals walking across wet ground, sometimes adults and children moving together, sometimes groups crossing landscapes that later hardened into stone or were buried under sediment. Unlike a tool, a footprint cannot easily be separated from the act that made it. Someone physically stood there. For a moment, the immense abstraction of prehistory becomes personal. Weight presses into mud, toes spread, a heel lifts, and then the person walks beyond the surviving surface and disappears again. That combination of enormous time and fragile evidence defines the world before recorded history. It is not a blank era. It is an overwhelmingly full era from which only tiny portions remain visible. Every archaeological site is an accidental survivor surrounded by countless lost places. Every reconstructed migration represents generations of unnamed people. Every genetic signal compresses thousands of births, deaths, meetings, separations, and journeys into a pattern scientists can only partially recover. And behind all of those scattered traces lies a planet that would often seem unfamiliar to modern eyes. Ice sheets cover enormous regions. Grasslands stretch across places that are now seabeds. Deserts turn green and then dry again. Animals larger than almost anything alive today move through landscapes inhabited by several forms of humanity at once. Before the first lines of recorded history appear, the stage has already changed again and again. To understand how that hidden world became ours, the story must begin in a colder age, when ice ruled entire continents, and humanity survived near the margins of a planet in constant motion. The cold does not arrive as a single event. It advances and retreats across thousands of years, reshaping the planet so slowly that no individual lifetime can witness the full transformation. Yet generation after generation lives inside its consequences. Snow survives longer on high ground. Glaciers thicken in mountain valleys. Northern forests shrink. Great ice sheets spread across much of North America and northern Europe, locking enormous quantities of water onto land. At the coldest points of the late Pleistocene sea level falls by more than 100 meters below its modern position. The geography of the world changes. Coastlines push outward. Shallow seas become plains. Islands connect to continents. Rivers carve routes across territories that will eventually vanish beneath water. Human beings do not merely survive an ice age. They inhabit a planet whose map repeatedly redraws itself. The popular image of this world is often a white wilderness beneath endless snow, but much of the Ice Age landscape looks very different. South of the Great Ice Sheets, immense regions form what scientists often describe as Mammoth Steppe, a cold, dry mosaic of grasses, herbs, and low vegetation, stretching across much of northern Eurasia and into Beringia. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, horses, reindeer, bison, musk oxen, and other large herbivores move through these environments. Predators follow them. Lions once roam parts of Europe and northern Asia. Hyenas occupy regions far beyond their modern range. Giant bears use caves. Wolves compete with human hunters for prey and carcasses. The environment is harsh, but it is not empty. In some places, it supports enormous animal biomass. For people living there, survival depends on reading landscapes with an attention modern urban life rarely demands. Tracks indicate how recently animals passed. Wind direction influences where scent travels. Snow depth affects movement. River ice can become a road or a trap. Seasonal migrations determine when particular valleys become rich hunting grounds. Wood may be scarce on open steppe, forcing people to use bone antler dung or whatever combustible material can be gathered. Clothing is not a convenience. In severe cold, it becomes technology essential to survival, and although garments themselves rarely preserve stone tools, bone needles, hide working equipment, and patterns of occupation suggest sophisticated methods of preparing animal skins and constructing layered protection. Fire is equally important, but fire in deep prehistory is more complicated than a simple image of people sitting around a permanent campfire. Hearths preserve unevenly, and scholars still debate aspects of how consistently earlier human populations could create, maintain, and transport fire across different periods and regions. By the time Homo sapiens is spreading widely through Ice Age Eurasia, however controlled fire is deeply integrated into daily life. It cooks food, provides warmth, hardens some materials, protects against predators, extends social activity into darkness, and transforms the internal space of camps and shelters. A hearth is technological, ecological, and social at the same time. The animals surrounding these communities are not merely food. Their bodies provide an extraordinary range of materials. Sinew becomes binding, hide becomes clothing, bedding, shelter, covering, and containers. Antler becomes points and tools. Bone can become needles, awls, ornaments, handles, and structural material. Fat supplies concentrated energy crucial in cold environments, where lean meat alone can be insufficient. Even animal dung may serve as fuel in treeless regions. The more closely archaeologists examine Ice Age sites, the clearer it becomes that successful hunting involves not only killing large animals, but understanding how to use almost every useful part of them. Large game hunting itself is dangerous and probably highly organized. A mammoth bison or wild horse is not passive prey. Injuries that are easily treated today can become fatal in a world without antibiotics or modern surgery. Archaeological evidence sometimes shows prehistoric individuals surviving severe trauma or disabilities for years, suggesting that group care matters greatly. One of the less appreciated features of Ice Age survival is therefore cooperation. The heroic image of a lone hunter is poorly suited to a world where food sharing, child care, knowledge transmission, wound care, and collective defense probably determine whether small communities endure. Population density remains extremely low across much of the planet. Groups may travel through territories so large that encounters with outsiders are infrequent but socially important. Networks between bands likely help people exchange mates, knowledge, materials, and support during difficult periods. Archaeologists have found objects made from shells or stones transported hundreds of kilometers from their geological sources. These materials do not necessarily travel through a single direct journey. They may pass between communities through repeated exchange, forming social networks extending far beyond the distance any one person routinely travels. Such networks matter because Ice Age climate is unstable. Conditions can change dramatically over centuries, and sometimes surprisingly quickly on geological timescales. Greenland ice cores and other climate records show abrupt fluctuations during portions of the last glacial period. Temperatures rise and fall, rainfall patterns shift, vegetation zones migrate, and animal populations respond. Human groups must respond with them. A valley that supports abundant game for generations may become less productive. A route across open grassland may slowly turn into woodland. Water sources move, coastlines change. The most successful societies are not simply those strongest enough to endure cold, but those flexible enough to adjust when familiar patterns fail. One surprising feature of these populations is the geographic breadth they eventually achieve. Humans occupy environments ranging from African savannas and tropical forests to the cold margins of Eurasia. Reaching high latitudes requires more than biological adaptation. It requires culture to function as an additional survival system. Clothing shelter, construction, food storage, hunting technology, fire management, seasonal planning and shared knowledge allow bodies evolved in Africa to survive climates for which they are not naturally insulated. Human technology begins to do what fur-thick fat or specialized anatomy does for other animals. Yet Homo sapiens is not alone in mastering these environments. Across Western Eurasia, Neanderthals have already endured repeated climatic oscillations for hundreds of thousands of years. Farther east, other human populations leave traces that scientists are still learning to identify. Some are known more clearly from their DNA than from their bones. The Ice Age landscape is therefore not simply a stage on which modern humans expand into empty territory. It is already inhabited by other human lineages, each carrying its own history of adaptation. This realization has transformed our understanding of prehistory. For generations, human evolution was often drawn as a neat progression toward a single surviving species. The deeper record shows something more tangled. Different forms of humans overlap in time. They occupy neighboring regions. Some populations meet, some interbreed. Others disappear without leaving clear explanations. The world before recorded history is not only environmentally different from ours, it is populated by a diversity of humans that the modern world no longer possesses. And as the ice sheets expand and contract across the continents, those different human groups begin to encounter one another in landscapes where survival already demands extraordinary adaptability. The result is not a simple replacement story. It is a complicated history of coexistence movement, exchange, competition, and genetic inheritance, much of which survives not in ancient texts, but inside living people today. For a long time, the human past was imagined as a narrow road. One species followed another, each supposedly more advanced than the last, until modern humans finally appeared at the end of the line. It was a comforting picture because it made evolution look orderly. But the deeper scientists push into the prehistoric record, the less orderly that picture becomes. The Ice Age world is not inhabited by a single form of humanity waiting to become us. It is crowded with relatives. Neanderthals occupy large parts of Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans leave genetic traces across Asia, despite a remarkably sparse fossil record. Other archaic human populations survive in regions where their identities remain uncertain. Homo sapiens emerges from Africa into a world already occupied by people who are neither fully like us nor completely separate from us. Neanderthals are the most familiar of these lost relatives, partly because their remains have been known for more than a century, and partly because they lived across regions later heavily studied by European archaeologists. They are physically distinctive. Their bodies are generally robust with powerful limbs, broad trunks, and skeletal features, often interpreted as adaptations suited to demanding lives in variable and sometimes cold environments. Their skulls differ from those of most living humans, with large brow ridges, long, low cranial shapes, and projecting mid-faces. Yet the old caricature of Neanderthals as dim, shambling brutes has become increasingly difficult to defend. Their brains are large, their stone technologies can be highly sophisticated. They hunt dangerous animals, control fire, exploit varied environments, and repeatedly demonstrate forms of planning that require extensive knowledge. At some sites, Neanderthal behavior reveals unexpected complexity. They collect pigments. They use adhesives to attach stone points to wooden shafts or handles. Some evidence suggests they gather unusual natural objects that may have held symbolic significance. There are also cases interpreted as deliberate burials, though individual examples remain debated. None of this proves that Neanderthal minds worked exactly like those of Homo sapiens, and scholars still debate the scale and meaning of apparent symbolic behavior. But the evidence increasingly suggests that the mental gulf once imagined between the two populations was much narrower than early theories assumed. Then there are the Denisovans, perhaps the most extraordinary example of how genetics has changed prehistory. Their existence was first recognized not through a complete skeleton or an obvious fossil skull, but through genetic material recovered from fragmentary remains in Denisova Cave in Siberia. A tiny finger bone and a few teeth helped reveal a population genetically distinct from both modern humans and Neanderthals. Later discoveries and genetic comparisons expanded the picture. Denisovans appear to have occupied a broad and complicated geographic range, although their fossil record remains extremely incomplete. Genetic ancestry related to Denisovans survives today at especially high levels in some populations of Oceania and parts of island Southeast Asia, while other Denisovan-related signals appear in Asian populations. One particularly striking legacy involves adaptation to high altitude. A version of the EPAS1 gene associated with Tibetan adaptation to low-oxygen environments appears to have entered the ancestors of modern Tibetans through ancient interbreeding with a Denisovan-related population. This means an encounter between different human groups tens of thousands of years ago may still influence how people survive on the Tibetan plateau today. The inheritance is not metaphorical. A piece of an extinct population remains biologically active in living humans. Neanderthal ancestry is even more widespread. Most people with substantial ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa carry a small percentage of DNA inherited from Neanderthals. Different individuals carry different fragments, so collectively modern populations preserve a much larger portion of the Neanderthal genome than any single person does. Some inherited variants appear to have influenced immune function, skin biology, metabolism, and other traits. Their effects are complex, and not every inherited variant was beneficial. Evolution keeps what happens to survive, not what fits a clean narrative. This genetic evidence changes the language of extinction. Neanderthals disappear as a recognizable population around 40,000 years ago, but they do not vanish without descendants. Some of them become part of the ancestry of later humans through interbreeding. Denisovan populations similarly leave genetic contributions across parts of Asia and Oceania. The boundaries between human groups are therefore porous. They are distinct enough to form identifiable populations, yet close enough biologically to produce descendants together. The encounters themselves are almost invisible archaeologically. A genetic sequence can demonstrate that populations mixed, but it cannot tell us what an individual meeting looked like. It does not preserve whether contact was peaceful or violent, temporary or sustained, welcomed or resisted. There is no written account from either side. What survives in the record suggests repeated interaction over long periods, rather than one extraordinary meeting. The human world of Eurasia is probably a patchwork of populations moving, separating, reconnecting, and sometimes absorbing one another. Other discoveries make the picture even more complicated. On the Indonesian island of Flores, Homo floresiensis survives until surprisingly late in prehistory. These small-bodied humans, known from remains found at Liang Bua Cave, evolved in isolation under conditions still being studied. On Luzon in the Philippines, Homo luzonensis adds another branch to the late prehistoric human landscape. The precise evolutionary relationships of these populations remain uncertain. Their fossils are limited and tropical environments are poor at preserving ancient DNA. No single explanation fully accounts for how many distinct human populations existed across Asia, or exactly how they were related. Africa, where Homo sapiens emerges, may have been equally complex. Genetic studies suggest that ancient population structure within Africa was deep and persistent. Instead of a simple origin in one tiny isolated homeland, modern humans may have thus merged through interactions among populations distributed across different African regions over long periods. Fossils from places such as Jebel Irhoud in Morocco show combinations of modern and archaic anatomical features dating back roughly 300,000 years. The species itself seems to take shape gradually rather than appearing suddenly in a single perfect form. This matters because the people leaving Africa later are already products of a complicated evolutionary history. When some Homo sapiens populations expand into Eurasia, they encounter relatives whose own lineages have been evolving separately for hundreds of thousands of years. These meetings do not occur in a vacuum. Each group has technologies, ecological knowledge, social networks, and ways of surviving shaped by different landscapes. Why Homo sapiens eventually becomes the only surviving human species remains one of prehistory's largest questions. Climate instability probably matters. Population size may matter. Social networks, mobility technology, disease competition, and simple demographic chance may all contribute. Some groups may be absorbed through interbreeding rather than eliminated outright. The evidence remains incomplete, and attempts to identify one decisive superiority in Homo sapiens usually simplify a much more complicated process. By about 40,000 years ago, however, the diversity begins to narrow dramatically. Neanderthals disappear from the archaeological record. Other populations fade from view. Homo sapiens continues spreading through environments previously occupied by several human lineages. Within a relatively short span of deep time, a planet shared among different kinds of humans becomes a planet occupied by only one, but the surviving species carries pieces of that lost diversity inside itself. The ancient world does not disappear completely. It becomes fragmented, hidden in genomes buried in caves and preserved in scattered bones. And as Homo sapiens expands farther across the planet, those survivors move through landscapes equally strange to modern eyes, crossing plains that are now oceans, and following coastlines that no longer exist. As Homo sapiens spreads farther from its African origins, the map guiding those movements bears little resemblance to the modern one. The difference is not only political borders or vanished forests. Entire pieces of geography have disappeared. During the coldest phases of the Ice Age, enough water is trapped in continental ice sheets to lower global sea level dramatically. Shallow seas retreat, exposing vast plains along continental margins. Rivers run across ground that's now seabed. Islands merge into larger land masses. Narrow channels vanish. Migration routes open, where today only open water remains. For thousands of generations, human beings move across a planet whose coastlines shift with climate. One of the most important of these lost regions lies between northeastern Asia and northwestern North America. During periods of lowered sea level, the floor of the Bering Strait becomes dry land, forming part of a much broader territory known as Beringia. This is not merely a narrow bridge crossed in a single heroic migration. At times, it's an enormous ecological region stretching across parts of Siberia, Alaska, and the exposed land between them. Cold grasslands and shrub tundra support large mammals, while human groups adapt to environments far from the warmer regions, where their distant ancestors evolved. The peopling of the Americas remains an active field of research, and scholars still debate the precise timing and routes involved, but genetic and archaeological evidence now strongly supports human presence in the Americas before the classic Clovis horizon once treated as the beginning of the story. The older model imagined people moving rapidly through an interior corridor between North American ice sheets after the last glacial maximum. That route may eventually have been used, but evidence increasingly suggests that coastal movement also played an important role. The problem is frustratingly simple. Much of the coastline those early travelers would have known now lies underwater. As sea levels rise after the Ice Age, possible campsites, estuaries, river mouths, and travel routes are submerged. Archaeologists are trying to recover pieces of this lost record through underwater survey and by studying coastal sites that escaped drowning, but the evidence remains incomplete. The same problem appears across much of Southeast Asia. During glacial periods, the islands of Sumatra, Java, and Borneo connect to the Asian mainland as part of a huge exposed landmass often called Sundaland. Large river systems cross plains that are now beneath the South China Sea and Java Sea. Human and animal populations can move through landscapes that later fragment into islands. Beyond Sundaland lies Sahul, the combined Ice Age continent formed by Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania when sea levels are lower. Yet even at maximum sea level fall, deep channels remain between Sundaland and Sahul. Reaching Sahul therefore requires open water crossings. That fact makes the early settlement of Australia and New Guinea one of the most remarkable episodes in deep human history. Archaeological evidence places people in Sahul tens of thousands of years ago, probably by at least around 65,000 years ago, according to influential findings from northern Australia, though exact chronologies and interpretations continue to be debated. Whatever the precise date humans have to cross stretches of sea to get there, they cannot simply walk from Asia. Those crossings imply planning, watercraft group coordination, and knowledge of marine conditions. The vessels themselves are gone. Wood reeds, bark, fibre, and rope rarely survive across such enormous spans of time. Yet the presence of people on the far side proves that some workable technology existed. This is a recurring feature of prehistory. The most important evidence can sometimes be the consequence of an invention, rather than the invention itself. No Ice Age boat from the first settlement of Sahul has survived, but human occupation beyond deep water barriers makes some form of boat unavoidable. Movement does not always mean rapid expansion into unknown territory. Human migration usually unfolds over generations. A family may move only a short distance within a lifetime, while the population as a whole shifts hundreds or thousands of kilometers over centuries. Rivers, lakes, valleys, animal migrations, coastlines, and seasonal plant resources shape these decisions. The term migration can make such processes sound deliberate and directional, as though prehistoric people possessed a continental destination. Most probably do not. They follow opportunities, avoid dangers, maintain social relationships, and respond to environmental change. The geographic result becomes visible only when viewed from thousands of years later. Coasts may have been particularly valuable corridors. Marine environments can provide shellfish, fish, seabirds, sea mammals, edible plants, and fresh water near river outlets. Movement along a shoreline also offers a recognizable geographic guide. Yet archaeological preservation works against understanding these routes because post-glacial sea level rise destroys or buries precisely the places where evidence might be expected. What survives inland can therefore exaggerate the apparent importance of inland movement. Elsewhere, humans cross landscapes that change without being submerged. The Sahara, now one of Earth's greatest deserts, repeatedly shifts between much wetter and much drier conditions, as orbital cycles alter African monsoons. During humid phases, lakes spread across regions now dominated by sand. Rivers flow through areas presently without permanent surface water. Grasslands and savannas support fish, crocodiles, hippopotamuses, cattle, and human communities deep within what is now desert. Rock art and archaeological sites preserve fragments of these greener worlds. When aridity returns, populations retreat toward more reliable water sources, turning climate change into a force that reorganizes migration across northern Africa. Mountains, too, prove less absolute as barriers than once assumed. Archaeological sites at high elevations show that prehistoric humans enter difficult upland environments earlier than older models often expected. Knowledge of seasonal routes and physiological adaptation eventually allow populations to occupy places where oxygen is thin and winters severe. Islands are reached. Arctic regions are inhabited. Dense forests become homes rather than obstacles. Humanity's geographic expansion is less a single journey than a long accumulation of local solutions. Not every movement leaves descendants. Populations can enter regions and later disappear. Climate may close a route behind them. A small group may die out. Later migrations can replace or absorb earlier inhabitants. Genetics reveals repeated episodes of population turnover that archaeology alone might miss. At the same time, archaeological cultures do not always correspond neatly to biological populations. A new tool style can spread through learning without mass migration, while people can move without immediately transforming every artifact tradition. Scholars still debate the balance between movement, cultural transmission, and local innovation in many prehistoric transitions. The routes themselves are therefore easier to sketch than the lives lived along them. Somewhere on the exposed floor of a modern sea, people once lit fires and repaired tools. Children grew up beside rivers whose mouths now lie kilometers offshore. Groups crossed mountain passes with no knowledge that descendants would one day inhabit entirely different continents. A shoreline that seemed permanent retreated generation by generation until it was gone. By the end of these long movements, Homo sapiens occupies an extraordinary range of environments. Yet expansion has consequences beyond geography. Humans increasingly enter ecosystems whose large animals have never encountered this particular kind of cooperative predator. At almost the same time, climates begin changing with enormous force. Across several continents, giant mammals that had dominated landscapes for thousands of years begin to disappear. Whether human hunters, environmental upheaval, or some combination of both drove those extinctions remains one of prehistory's most enduring disputes. The great animals do not vanish all at once, and they do not disappear everywhere for the same reason. Their decline unfolds unevenly across thousands of years, continent by continent, species by species, against a background of climatic instability and expanding human populations. Mammoths survive in some regions long after they disappear from others. Giant ground sloths persist in the Americas until relatively late in the Pleistocene. Australia loses many of its largest animals earlier still. On different continents, the timing changes, the ecological settings differ, and the evidence refuses to settle into one simple explanation. Yet something profound is happening. The world Homo sapiens enters is filled with creatures that later generations will never see alive. In Eurasia, mammoths move across open grasslands in large herds. Woolly rhinoceroses graze in cold steppe environments. Giant deer carry antlers so broad they seem almost impossible. Cave lions stalk prey across regions where lions no longer live. In the Americas, there are mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, enormous beavers, camels, horses, and several species of proboscideans. Australia supports giant marsupials and formidable reptiles unlike anything surviving there today. These animals are not rare curiosities at the edges of human life. In many places, they are central components of the ecosystems people enter. Human hunters possess one advantage that has little to do with physical strength. They cooperate. A single person with a stone-tipped spear is vulnerable against a large herbivore. A group using terrain fire, coordinated movement, projectile weapons, and accumulated knowledge becomes far more dangerous. Archaeological sites sometimes preserve butchered bones alongside stone tools, showing that humans process large game repeatedly. Cut marks reveal where flesh is removed. Breakage patterns show bones opened for marrow. At some sites, remains of mammoths, horses, bison, or other animals occur in concentrations that suggest intensive exploitation. But hunting evidence must be interpreted carefully. A butchered animal does not prove a species was hunted to extinction. People may scavenge carcasses as well as kill animals directly. Large mammals also die naturally in groups during droughts, floods, or seasonal stress. The existence of hunting says humans are predators, not that they alone caused a continent-wide ecological collapse. This distinction is crucial because the extinction debate has often been forced into overly simple camps. Climate provides the other obvious force. The end of the Pleistocene brings dramatic environmental change. Temperatures rise, ice sheets retreat, rainfall patterns shift, grasslands shrink or reorganize, forests advance into former steppe. Wetlands appear in some places and disappear in others. Animals adapted to cold, open environments lose habitat. Plant communities change quickly enough that familiar seasonal food sources may become unreliable. For species already living near ecological limits, even moderate additional pressure can become serious. The challenge is that humans and climate change often arrive together. In North America, large-scale megafaunal extinctions cluster broadly around the period when human populations are expanding and the climate is changing rapidly. That overlap makes causation difficult to untangle. Some researchers emphasize overhunting, arguing that large animals with slow reproductive rates can decline sharply even under relatively modest hunting pressure. Others emphasize habitat transformation and climatic stress. Increasingly, many scholars consider combined models in which environmental instability weakens populations, while hunting adds another layer of mortality. Australia offers a different pattern. Many megafaunal extinctions there occur long before the end of the last ice age, and overlap broadly with the arrival and spread of humans. This has led to strong arguments for human influence, including hunting and landscape modification through burning. Yet the chronology remains debated in detail, and long-term aridification also shapes Australian ecosystems. Once again, no single explanation fully accounts for every species or region. One surprising feature of these extinction events is how slowly they may have appeared to the people living through them. A modern observer sees a species vanish on a timeline compressed into a chart. A prehistoric community may experience only subtle changes. A herd that once passed a valley every year becomes smaller. A hunting ground produces fewer animals. Older people remember seeing a creature more often than younger hunters do. Eventually, a generation grows up for whom the animal is unusual. Later, still, it is gone. Extinction at human scale can feel less like a catastrophe and more like a fading absence. The disappearance of large animals does more than change hunting. It changes landscapes. Large herbivores shape vegetation by grazing, trampling, dispersing seeds, breaking branches and moving nutrients. Their loss can alter fire regimes and plant communities. Predators dependent on them may decline as well. Humans therefore enter not merely a different food economy, but ecosystems undergoing structural transformation. At the same time, human technology continues to become more varied and specialized. Hunting tools are refined according to prey and environment. Stone blades can be set into composite weapons. Bone and antler points allow different forms of penetration and durability. Spear-throwing devices increase range and force in some regions. Later bows and arrows appear in parts of the world, though their earliest dates and regional development remain subjects of continuing research. Nets, traps, snares, fish hooks, and other perishable technologies almost certainly play larger roles than the surviving archaeological record suggests. People are also broadening their diets. The stereotype of Ice Age humans living almost entirely on mammoth meat is misleading. Depending on region, communities exploit fish, shellfish, birds, small mammals, roots, seeds, nuts, fruits, and other plants. Grinding stones and microscopic plant residues reveal food processing that leaves little dramatic evidence. In some environments, plant knowledge may be as essential as hunting skill. Survival depends on understanding seasons rather than pursuing one spectacular prey species. Fire begins to affect landscapes more deliberately as well. Human groups in various regions likely use controlled burning to clear vegetation, encourage particular plants, improve visibility, attract grazing animals, or facilitate travel. The scale and antiquity of such landscape management remain debated, but the broader lesson is clear. Prehistoric humans are not passive occupants of untouched wilderness. They increasingly alter ecological systems in ways that can accumulate over generations. That does not make them modern industrial destroyers in miniature. Their populations remain tiny, their technologies limited, and their environmental impacts highly variable. But the older romantic picture of prehistoric people living without meaningful ecological influence is equally unrealistic. Humans have been ecosystem participants and modifiers for a very long time. By the late Pleistocene, then, the world is changing from both directions. Climate reshapes environments while humans spread into new territories with flexible technologies and widening social networks. Large animals disappear, habitats reorganize. Some species survive by shifting ranges, others do not. People respond by hunting different prey, exploiting more aquatic resources, and adapting to increasingly local environments. Yet something else is becoming visible in the archaeological record, something less immediately practical than a spear point or hearth. People begin leaving behind objects whose purpose cannot be explained by survival alone. Pigments are carried over distance, shells are pierced for ornament, cave walls fill with animals, signs, hands, and abstract forms. Bones become flutes, bodies are buried with objects and colored minerals. The human world is no longer revealed only through what people eat or how they hunt. Increasingly, it also preserves traces of what they may have imagined. Somewhere in the darkness of Ice Age Europe, a person carries a small flame beyond the reach of daylight. The passage narrows. Rock walls close around the moving light, and familiar sounds from the outside world disappear. Hundreds of meters from the cave entrance, where there is no practical reason to live and little reason to hunt, people repeatedly return. They bring pigments, lamps, tools, and sometimes children. On the walls they leave horses, bison, mammoths, lions, rhinoceroses, handprints, geometric signs, and creatures whose forms are difficult to interpret. Thousands of years later, the images survive while almost everything that explained them is gone. No accompanying text identifies their makers. No preserved story tells why particular animals appear in particular chambers. The pictures are among the most vivid surviving expressions of prehistoric minds, yet their meanings remain largely beyond reach. Sites such as Chauvet in France preserve extraordinary animal images dating back more than 30,000 years. Lascaux, created much later, contains hundreds of painted and engraved figures. Altamira in Spain preserves famous bison across its cave surfaces. But cave art is neither exclusively European nor a single tradition. Ancient painted and engraved imagery appears in Africa, Asia, Australia, and elsewhere, and discoveries in Indonesia have demonstrated that sophisticated figurative art has deep roots far beyond Western Europe. Some cave paintings on Sulawesi are tens of thousands of years old, reinforcing a growing understanding that symbolic image-making was widespread among early Homo sapiens. The technical process alone reveals planning. Pigments may be made from ochre, charcoal, manganese compounds, and other minerals. Materials are crushed, mixed, carried and applied by fingers, brushes, pads, blowing techniques, or other methods. Artists sometimes use the natural shape of rock to give an animal apparent volume. A bulge becomes a shoulder, a crack becomes part of a back. Multiple legs can suggest movement. Some images occur in places requiring difficult climbs or journeys through narrow passages, meaning their creation demands more than casual decoration. Why people do this is much harder to establish. Older interpretations sometimes treated cave paintings as straightforward hunting magic, assuming animals were depicted to ensure successful kills. That explanation cannot account comfortably for everything. Species painted most frequently are not always those most commonly eaten. Other theories emphasize ritual storytelling, teaching altered states of consciousness, territorial identity mythology, or combinations of functions that changed across thousands of years. Scholars still debate these interpretations because the images provide almost no direct explanation of themselves. Their silence is precisely what makes them so compelling. Caves are only part of the symbolic record. People carry beads made from shells, teeth, bone, ivory, and stone. Some shells travel far inland, demonstrating that their value exceeds immediate usefulness. Ochre is transported and processed at sites extending deep into prehistory. Objects are engraved with repeated lines or geometric patterns. Figurines appear in several regions. Whether every marked object carries symbolic meaning is impossible to know, but repeated investment in ornament and visual pattern strongly suggests that appearance communicates information within social worlds. A bead seems insignificant beside a mammoth hunt, yet socially it can be revolutionary. Clothing protects the body, but clothing decorated with beads can identify the person wearing it. Ornament may communicate age affiliation, achievement, marital status, group, identity, spiritual role, or distinctions whose categories no longer exist. A stranger approaching across an Ice Age landscape may be read partly through visible signals before a word is exchanged. In a world of expanding social networks, such symbols can help organize relationships among people who do not interact every day. Music leaves even more fragile traces. Bone and ivory flutes discovered in European Upper Paleolithic contexts demonstrate that people deliberately manufacture musical instruments tens of thousands of years ago. These are not accidental whistles. Creating holes at controlled positions along a hollow object requires craftsmanship and an understanding of how sound changes. Other instruments made from wood, skin fiber, or gourds would preserve far less readily, so the surviving examples may represent only a small fraction of prehistoric music. The human voice leaves nothing archaeological at all, yet singing may be vastly older than surviving instruments. Rhythm requires no artifact. Hands clap, feet strike the ground, voices rise together, and all evidence disappears the moment the sound ends. The archaeological silence surrounding music therefore hides a potentially enormous part of prehistoric life. Communities may have used rhythm and song during work ritual mourning, courtship, teaching, storytelling, or simply social gathering. What survives in the record suggests complex symbolic behavior, but the richest performances may have left no physical trace. Burial offers another window into prehistoric minds, though it must be interpreted cautiously. Deliberate burials appear among both Homo sapiens and possibly Neanderthals. Some bodies are placed carefully. Red ochre appears in certain graves. Objects accompany the dead in some contexts. At Sungir in Russia, burials dating to more than 30,000 years ago contain extraordinary quantities of beads and elaborate grave goods, including the graves of young individuals. Thousands of labor-intensive ivory beads suggest substantial investment in funerary treatment, and perhaps forms of inherited or socially assigned status. Still, burial does not provide a direct map of prehistoric religion. A body placed with objects may indicate belief in an afterlife, but it could also express grief, identity, memory, social obligation, or respect without requiring a specific supernatural doctrine. The evidence remains incomplete. What can be said more confidently is that some prehistoric communities treat death as something requiring structured action. The dead are not always simply abandoned. Their bodies can become the focus of deliberate practices carrying meaning for the living. Perhaps even more revealing is the evidence for care before death. Some prehistoric skeletons show serious injuries or physical impairments that individuals survived for considerable periods. Survival in such cases may require food-sharing protection or assistance. This does not prove modern concepts of compassion existed unchanged, but it demonstrates that human communities sometimes invest resources in members who cannot temporarily or perhaps permanently contribute in ordinary ways. Social life is becoming visible not merely as cooperation in hunting, but as sustained relationships between individuals. By this point, the prehistoric world is filled with things that exist mainly because people agree they matter. A shell can become an ornament. A cave chamber can become a meaningful destination. Red mineral powder can acquire significance beyond its chemical properties. A dead body can demand ceremony. An animal painted on stone can become something more than an animal encountered in the landscape. Humans are building a second environment layered over the physical one, a world of symbols, memories, identities, and shared meanings. And while that symbolic world grows richer, the physical world is approaching one of its greatest transformations. For thousands of years, glaciers have shaped coastlines, migration routes, ecosystems, and the rhythms of human survival. Then the balance begins to shift decisively. Temperatures rise, ice retreats, vegetation reorganizes, and seas start reclaiming the immense plains exposed during the glacial age. The people who painted caves and carried shells across continents are about to inherit a warmer planet, but the end of the Ice Age will bring losses as profound as its opportunities. The warming begins unevenly, almost deceptively. Glaciers that have dominated northern landscapes retreat, vegetation moves into ground once held by cold steppe, and rivers swollen by meltwater cut new channels across exposed terrain. For communities living through these changes, there is no single morning when the Ice Age ends. The transformation stretches across generations, interrupted by sudden reversals and regional differences. Children grow up in environments their grandparents would recognize, but perhaps not completely. Herds shift their routes. Familiar plants become less common. Forests advance across former hunting grounds. Lakes appear where drainage has changed while other water sources shrink. The world is becoming warmer, but warmer does not mean stable. Around 11,700 years ago, the beginning of the Holocene marks the end of the Pleistocene in geological convention. The transition follows a period of dramatic climatic instability. One of its most famous episodes is the Younger Dryas, a return to colder conditions beginning roughly 12,900 years ago and lasting for about 12 centuries, with particularly strong effects around the North Atlantic. Regions that had begun warming experience renewed cold. Then temperatures rise again rapidly at the end of the event. The causes involve changes in ocean circulation and freshwater input associated with retreating ice, although the details remain an active area of research. For prehistoric communities, such climatic language translates into practical uncertainty. Reindeer that flourish in colder environments withdraw northward from many regions. Forest animals become more important elsewhere. Fishing, gathering, trapping, and hunting smaller game expand in significance as ecosystems reorganize. Toolkits change accordingly. In parts of Europe, the broad archaeological transition from Paleolithic to Mesolithic lifeways reflects communities adjusting to woodland environments, changing coastlines, and more varied resources. These labels are modern categories imposed on a complex process, but they capture something real. Strategies that worked on open Ice Age plains are no longer always appropriate. Forests can be rich environments, yet they require different knowledge. Large herds become harder to locate through dense vegetation. Animals may be dispersed rather than concentrated across open country. Hunters increasingly rely on weapons effective in wooded settings, including bows in regions where archaeological evidence supports their use. Lakes, rivers, wetlands, and coasts provide fish, shellfish, waterfowl, and aquatic mammals. Microliths, tiny, carefully shaped stone elements often fitted into composite tools, become widespread in many post-glacial societies. The technology may look less spectacular than a massive spear point, but it reflects flexible engineering in which small replaceable components create efficient weapons and cutting implements. At the same time, rising seas begin erasing enormous portions of the old world. As continental ice melts, global sea level climbs by roughly 120 meters, from its glacial low towards something approaching modern levels. The process takes thousands of years, but it is not always smooth. At certain intervals, meltwater pulses accelerate the rise. Low coastal plains flood. Estuaries move inland. River valleys become bays. Freshwater environments turn brackish and then marine. The people experiencing this have no concept of global sea level, but they know particular places are changing. A campsite once safely inland becomes closer to tidal water over generations. A hunting ground becomes marsh. A familiar path disappears. Communities relocate, sometimes repeatedly. Oral memory could potentially preserve knowledge of drowned landscapes for generations, although linking later traditions directly to specific prehistoric inundations is difficult and must be approached cautiously. Other changes can be much more violent. Retreating glaciers leave unstable lakes dammed by ice or sediment. When natural barriers fail, immense floods can reshape landscapes rapidly. In North America, the repeated drainage of glacial Lake Missoula during earlier phases of deglaciation sends extraordinary volumes of water across the Pacific Northwest, carving the channeled scablands. Elsewhere, enormous glacial lakes alter river systems as ice sheets retreat. These events remind us that prehistoric environmental change does not always happen slowly enough for communities to adjust comfortably. Volcanic eruptions add another source of instability. One of the most significant early Holocene eruptions occurs at Mount Mazama in what is now Oregon roughly 7,700 years ago, creating Crater Lake and spreading ash across a broad region. Earlier and later eruptions elsewhere affect local populations in different ways. Ash can destroy vegetation and contaminate water nearby, yet volcanic landscapes eventually produce fertile soils. Human communities repeatedly return to dangerous environments because the same geological forces that threaten settlement can also create resources. The disappearance of the great ice sheets has another consequence. Land itself moves. The enormous weight of ice has pressed portions of Earth's crust downward. As the ice melts, formerly glaciated regions begin rebounding upward, a process that continues today. Elsewhere, changes in water load and crustal adjustment alter relative sea level in complicated ways. A prehistoric shoreline can therefore rise above the modern coast in one region, while disappearing beneath the sea in another. Reconstructing ancient geography requires geologists to account not merely for water volume, but for the slow movement of the planet's crust. Human populations respond with remarkable flexibility. Some communities become increasingly settled around rich aquatic environments, where food can be harvested seasonally from a relatively small territory. Storage becomes more important in certain regions. Cemeteries appear in some hunter-gatherer societies, suggesting stronger attachments to particular places. Exchange networks continue carrying materials over long distances. The old assumption that mobile hunter-gatherers must always live in small, simple, constantly wandering groups begins to fail when confronted with the diversity of early Holocene societies. Yet the warming world also brings pressures. Greater population density can increase competition over productive territories. New ecosystems create new patterns of disease exposure. Local resources can be overused. Seasonal abundance must be balanced against periods of scarcity. Communities that become more attached to particular landscapes may find relocation socially or economically costly. Adaptation creates new possibilities, but it can also create new dependencies. One lesser-known transformation occurs beneath people's feet as plants and animals respond to warming faster than cultural memories may adjust. Species distributions move northward or uphill. Forest composition changes over centuries. In some areas, humans actively influence this process through burning, selective harvesting, and repeated disturbance. The boundary between natural climate-driven change and human landscape management becomes increasingly difficult to separate. By the early Holocene, the planet familiar to Ice Age hunters has largely vanished. Mammoth steppe contracts dramatically. Many megafaunal species are gone. Ice sheets retreat toward their modern remnants. Forests occupy huge areas. Seas cover former plains. Human communities respond not by following one universal path, but by becoming increasingly diverse in how they obtain food, organize movement, and occupy territory. Some of the richest places they once inhabited, however, are already disappearing from archaeological reach. The water rising along continental margins is not flooding empty ground. It is covering thousands of years of human activity, camps, hunting, territories, freshwater springs, river valleys, burial places, and perhaps settlements, unlike anything preserved inland. Beneath the North Sea, the Persian Gulf, Southeast Asian waters, and continental shelves around the world lie fragments of a prehistoric geography that once connected people and places, now separated by oceans. The end of the Ice Age therefore creates the modern world partly by destroying the old one, and nowhere is that loss more haunting than along the drowned landscapes where entire chapters of human prehistory may still rest beneath the sea. Beneath the grey water of the North Sea lies a landscape that once had rivers, wetlands, forests, grazing animals, and human footsteps. Fishing vessels cross above it without seeing the valleys below. Storms disturb sediments that accumulated after the sea arrived. Occasionally, nets and dredging operations have brought up prehistoric bones, antler tools, and other remains from places that are now kilometers offshore. The vanished territory is commonly called Doggerland, and during portions of the Ice Age and early Holocene it connects Britain to continental Europe. Britain is not yet an island. A person can move across broad lowlands between regions that modern maps separate with water. Doggerland is not one static environment. As the climate warms, its landscape changes repeatedly. Cold open terrain gives way to richer wetlands, rivers, woodland, and coastal zones. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers exploit these environments while sea level gradually rises around them. The territory contracts over generations. Low ground becomes marsh. River mouths shift inland. What was once an enormous plain becomes a shrinking collection of habitable areas until most of it disappears beneath the North Sea. A massive submarine landslide off Norway known as the Storegga Slide generates a tsunami roughly 8,200 years ago. Geological evidence shows that waves strike coastlines around the North Atlantic and North Sea, including parts of Britain. The event would have been devastating to communities in affected low-lying coastal areas. It is sometimes described dramatically as the catastrophe that destroyed Doggerland, but the reality is more complicated. Much of the landscape had already been lost to long-term sea level rise, and some higher areas may have persisted after the tsunami. No single disaster fully accounts for Doggerland's disappearance. The sea had been advancing for millennia. That slow loss may be even more unsettling than a single catastrophic flood. Generations can watch the geography of their ancestors steadily shrink. A place associated with seasonal gathering or hunting becomes inaccessible. A freshwater lake turns into a tidal lagoon. Families relocate inland, perhaps joining communities already occupying those territories. Such movements may create new alliances or new tensions. Archaeology can reconstruct changing shorelines, but the emotional geography of this retreat is almost entirely lost. Doggerland is only one example. Around the world, the continental shelves exposed during glacial periods contain enormous missing portions of prehistoric territory. In Southeast Asia, Sundaland once joins much of the modern Indonesian archipelago to mainland Asia. Rivers cross plains where ships now travel. As sea levels rise, mountains become islands and populations are increasingly separated by water. The transformation contributes to the extraordinary geography of modern Southeast Asia, but it also places much of the region's early human landscape beyond conventional land archaeology. Farther south, Australia and New Guinea, once joined within the larger continent of Sahul, become increasingly separated. Tasmania is cut off from mainland Australia as Bass Strait floods. Communities that had once occupied connected landscapes become island populations. These separations can alter exchange networks, access to resources, and patterns of cultural transmission. Geography does not determine culture mechanically, but changing geography changes the possibilities available to people. The Persian Gulf offers another intriguing case. During periods of the low sea level, much of the modern Gulf is exposed land crossed by river systems fed from surrounding regions. Some researchers have proposed that this basin may have provided attractive habitats for prehistoric populations before flooding transformed it into the modern Gulf. Archaeological evidence around its margins demonstrates deep human occupation, but identifying settlements now submerged beneath sediments and water remains difficult. The possibility is important because later civilizations arise around a coastline whose deeper prehistoric geography looked radically different. The Black Sea has generated even more dramatic theories. Geological evidence confirms substantial changes in Black Sea water levels and connections with the Mediterranean after the Ice Age, but claims of an extremely rapid catastrophic flood inspiring later flood traditions remain disputed. The timing, speed, and scale of marine inflow have been debated for decades. It is tempting to connect geological events directly with famous myths, yet such links usually outrun the evidence. Oral traditions can preserve memories for remarkable periods, but demonstrating an uninterrupted chain from a specific prehistoric flood to a story recorded thousands of years later is extraordinarily difficult. What can be demonstrated is already remarkable enough. Sea level rise redraws the inhabited world. Globally, millions of square kilometers of formerly exposed continental shelf disappear. Some of these regions would have been among the most attractive environments for human settlement, because coastlines combine marine resources, freshwater access, transportation routes, and ecological diversity. The archaeological record left on modern dry land therefore represents only part of prehistoric human activity. This creates what might be called a preservation illusion. If archaeologists excavate only today's landscape, inland sites appear disproportionately important because ancient coastal sites are missing. Early maritime adaptation may look rarer than it really was. Population centers may appear farther from the coast than they actually were. Routes of migration can seem mysterious because the terrain connecting known sites has vanished. Underwater archaeology is beginning to change this picture, though the work is difficult. Researchers use sonar seismic mapping, sediment cores, bathymetric data, and reconstructions of ancient river systems to identify promising areas. Divers can investigate shallow sites, while remotely operated equipment can explore deeper environments. In some regions, prehistoric stone tools and submerged forests have been documented beneath modern seas. Yet searching continental shelves is vastly more expensive and complicated than walking across exposed archaeological terrain. Preservation underwater can also be surprisingly good under the right conditions. Sediments may seal organic material away from oxygen, protecting wood plant remains or other fragile evidence that would decay on land. But currents, erosion, construction, fishing, and sediment movement can destroy or scatter sites. The underwater record is therefore both promising and frustratingly uneven. The deeper implication is that prehistory has a geographical blind spot. Some apparent gaps in human history may exist not because people were absent, but because the places they occupied are inaccessible. A coastline used for thousands of years can disappear entirely from the visible archaeological map. Entire cultural traditions may be represented only by scattered survivors on former hills that became modern islands. As the seas approach something closer to their present boundaries, human communities are forced into a smaller terrestrial world, but this does not automatically produce crisis. In many regions, the warmer Holocene creates extraordinarily productive forests, wetlands, rivers, and coasts. People develop increasingly specialized relationships with these environments. Some build substantial dwellings. Some return to the same locations over generations. Some accumulate food objects and social obligations in ways once assumed to require agriculture. This is where another old picture of prehistory begins to collapse. The traditional story placed mobile hunters on one side of a great divide and settled farmers on the other. Yet between them lies a remarkable variety of societies that hunt and gather, while constructing permanent or semi-permanent communities, managing resources, maintaining extensive exchange networks, and sometimes creating monumental places. Before fields of domesticated grain transform much of the human world, people without farming are already demonstrating that social complexity does not begin with the plough. Along rivers, coasts, forests, and fertile grasslands, another experiment in human organization is already underway. For much of modern history, hunter-gatherers were treated as the opening stage of a simple progression. First came small wandering bands, then agriculture created villages. Villages became towns, towns became cities, and cities produced civilization. It was a neat sequence, easy to teach and deeply misleading. Long before farming becomes dominant, many communities are already experimenting with permanent storage, territorial identity exchange, ceremonial gathering, and forms of social organization that do not fit comfortably into the stereotype of endlessly mobile foragers. The early Holocene provides ideal conditions for this diversity. Warmer climates create rich ecological mosaics across many regions. Rivers support fish and waterfowl. Forests provide nuts, fruits, game timber, and edible plants. Wetlands concentrate resources in predictable seasons. Coastal zones offer shellfish, fish, sea mammals, and migratory birds. In certain environments, a community can obtain enough food from a relatively small territory that constant long-distance movement is no longer necessary. Mobility does not disappear, but it becomes more flexible. Some groups remain highly mobile. Others return repeatedly to favored places. Some establish large settlements used for much of the year. This pattern becomes especially visible in the Levant before the widespread adoption of agriculture. Communities associated with the Natufian tradition beginning more than 14,000 years ago occupy parts of the eastern Mediterranean and build substantial stone-founded structures. They harvest wild cereals, hunt gazelle, and other animals, use grinding stones, bury their dead in or near settlements, and maintain repeated connections to particular locations. They are still hunter-gatherers, but their way of life already includes elements once assumed to belong mainly to farmers. Grinding equipment is particularly revealing. A stone used repeatedly to process seeds can be heavy, inconvenient to carry, and closely tied to place. Its presence suggests investment in both local resources and the tools needed to exploit them. Storage features may similarly indicate planning beyond immediate consumption. Food collected during seasonal abundance can support people later, reducing some risks while creating new problems. Stored food has to be protected from moisture, insects, rodents, and other people. Storage changes social relationships in subtle ways. A fresh animal carcass must be eaten, shared, dried, or otherwise processed relatively quickly. A store of grain, nuts, or dried fish can remain under someone's control for longer. That raises questions of ownership, access, inheritance, obligation, and inequality. Archaeologists cannot always reconstruct how prehistoric communities answered those questions, but the material conditions allowing accumulated wealth are beginning to appear before full-scale farming. Far from the Levant, other hunter-gatherer societies develop their own forms of complexity. Along productive coasts, communities can support relatively large populations without cultivated crops. In parts of prehistoric Japan, Jomon societies build substantial settlements while relying heavily on hunting, fishing, gathering, and intensive use of forest resources. Pottery appears extremely early in East Asia, challenging older assumptions that ceramic technology belongs naturally to agricultural life. Containers can transform cooking, storage, and the processing of foods that are difficult to prepare directly over a fire. This is one of prehistory's quieter revolutions. A ceramic vessel does not look as dramatic as a monument, but it changes what can be eaten. Foods can be simmered for hours. Oils and nutrients can be extracted from fish or plants. Tough ingredients become digestible. Liquids can be stored or transported more efficiently. Residue analysis on pottery fragments now allows researchers to detect traces of ancient foods, revealing diets far more varied than the surviving bones alone might suggest. In other parts of the world, rich river systems generate similarly complex lifeways. Seasonal fish runs can provide enormous quantities of food. Communities develop traps, nets, weirs, hooks, boats, and preservation techniques that leave only partial archaeological evidence. Wooden technologies are particularly vulnerable to decay, meaning societies heavily dependent on timber and fiber may appear deceptively simple when only their stone tools survive. Exchange networks connect these communities across distances that can be surprising. Obsidian, valued for producing extremely sharp edges, travels far from volcanic sources. Marine shells appear inland. Particular stones, pigments, and ornaments move through chains of contact. These objects carry practical value, but they may also carry social meaning. A material originating hundreds of kilometers away can demonstrate connection to distant people or places. Exchange is therefore not simply primitive commerce. It can help maintain alliances, marriage networks, ritual relationships, and access to resources during difficult seasons. Large gatherings may strengthen those networks. Even communities dispersed across broad territories can meet periodically for ceremonies, exchange marriages, feasting, and information sharing. Such gatherings leave archaeological signatures when they occur repeatedly in the same location, though identifying their exact social purpose can be difficult. The same site might serve several functions across generations. Some hunter-gatherer populations also modify landscapes intentionally. Burning vegetation can encourage particular plants, create habitat attractive to game, clear travel corridors, and maintain open areas against forest expansion. Selective harvesting can alter plant distributions over time. Shellfish beds, fisheries, and nut-producing trees may be managed in ways that blur the modern distinction between wild and cultivated resources. Domestication is not a switch that suddenly turns humans into managers of nature. It emerges from a much longer history of intervention. That history matters because agriculture will eventually develop from relationships already extending across generations. People know which wild grains ripen first, which plants tolerate disturbed ground, which animals can be approached or controlled, and which landscapes become more productive when burned or cleared. Farming does not appear because someone suddenly invents the idea of planting food. Human communities have been manipulating environments long before domesticated crops dominate their diets, nor does settled life automatically require farming. In resource-rich environments, permanent or semi-permanent hunter-gatherer settlements can become socially intricate. Houses may be rebuilt in the same locations. Cemeteries create physical connections between communities and ancestors. Repeated occupation creates claims to place. Craft specialization may develop when some individuals invest heavily in particular skills. Differences in burial treatment suggest that status distinctions sometimes emerge even without agriculture. The evidence remains incomplete, and archaeologists must resist turning every large settlement into an early version of a city. Population size, political hierarchy, property systems, and ritual authority are often difficult to reconstruct. Yet the old ladder from simple hunter to complex farmer no longer works. Human societies experiment with many combinations of mobility settlement, storage cooperation, and inequality. This makes the eventual spread of agriculture more complicated than a straightforward improvement. Farming can produce large and relatively predictable food supplies, but it also demands labor-ties communities more closely to particular landscapes and exposes them to new forms of risk. Once people begin depending heavily on a narrow set of domesticated species, crop failure becomes dangerous in ways that a broad wild diet may not be. Settlements grow, but disease can spread more easily. Food production increases, but individual health may not always improve. The transition ahead is therefore not humanity discovering an obviously superior way of life. It is a long experiment whose advantages and costs accumulate together. People who once managed wild landscapes increasingly reshape plants, animals, and themselves around a new economic system. And from that dangerous experiment will come population growth, property, surplus, inequality, and eventually the foundations of the first cities. The first farmers do not know they are beginning a revolution. There is no moment when a community abandons hunting and gathering plants afield and suddenly enters a new age. The transformation is much slower and more uneven. For generations, people continue hunting wild animals while collecting plants they increasingly encourage, protect, harvest, and eventually cultivate. Some communities experiment with food production and later abandon it. Others combine farming with fishing or seasonal hunting for centuries. Domestication emerges through countless ordinary decisions until plants, animals, landscapes, and human societies have changed so deeply that returning to the older relationship with food becomes increasingly difficult. In the Fertile Crescent, people have gathered wild wheat, barley, lentils, and other plants long before these species become fully domesticated. Harvesting changes which plants reproduce. If people repeatedly collect seeds with particular characteristics, and later sow some of them near settlements, selection begins operating in a new direction. Over many generations, domesticated cereals develop traits useful to humans. One of the most important involves the seed head. Wild cereals benefit when ripe seeds detach naturally and scatter. Farmers benefit when seeds remain attached long enough to be harvested. A genetic change that would be disadvantageous in the wild can become extremely useful under cultivation. This transformation leaves evidence in ancient plant remains, allowing archaeobotanists to trace changes in grain morphology across time. But the process is slow. Early cultivators may manage plants for centuries before clear domestication traits dominate. Agriculture is therefore not simply an invention. It's a long evolutionary partnership, although one in which human preferences increasingly shape the direction of change. Animals undergo a similarly complicated transition. Dogs have already formed a relationship with humans before agriculture, probably emerging from ancient interactions between wolves and human populations, though the timing and pathways of domestication remain debated. Later sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle become central to food-producing economies in parts of Southwest Asia. Other regions domesticate different species according to local ecology. Chickens ultimately derive from Asian jungle fowl. Llamas and alpacas become important in the Andes. Different societies independently reshape relationships with animals rather than following a single agricultural package. Plants also have multiple centers of domestication. Rice becomes central in parts of Asia. Millet is cultivated in northern China. Maize emerges through a remarkable transformation of teosinte in Mesoamerica. Potatoes and quinoa are domesticated in the Andes. New Guinea develops important systems based on local plants. African communities domesticate crops such as sorghum and pearl millet. The evidence remains incomplete in several regions, but one conclusion is unavoidable. Agriculture is invented repeatedly. Why it begins is harder to answer. Older explanations often imagined starving hunter-gatherers forced to invent farming as wild resources disappeared. Yet many early agricultural experiments arise among communities already capable of exploiting diverse environments. Population pressure may contribute in some places. Climate change matters particularly as the relatively stable Holocene creates new ecological opportunities. Growing attachment to settlements, social competition, feasting storage, territoriality, and accumulated plant knowledge may also play roles. No single explanation fully accounts for independent agricultural origins across the world. Whatever the initial motivations, farming changes the scale of human life. A cultivated landscape can support far more people per unit area than many hunting and gathering systems. Population begins to grow. Villages expand. More children can be raised when families move less frequently, and carbohydrates from cultivated grains can provide abundant calories. But increased calories do not automatically mean better health. Some early farming populations show signs of nutritional stress compared with earlier hunter-gatherers. Dependence on a limited number of staple crops can reduce dietary diversity. Dental cavities often become more common as carbohydrate consumption increases. Repetitive agricultural labor leaves marks on skeletons. Grinding grain can introduce tiny particles of stone into food, contributing to severe tooth wear. Infectious disease becomes easier to transmit as people live in larger, denser settlements. The relationship with domesticated animals creates additional opportunities for pathogens, although the history of individual diseases is complex and cannot simply be reduced to livestock living beside humans. Permanent settlements also accumulate waste. Water sources can become contaminated. Parasites thrive where people repeatedly occupy the same ground. The agricultural village produces food efficiently, but it also creates an environment in which diseases can circulate in ways difficult among small mobile populations. Labor changes as well. Fields must be cleared, planted, weeded, protected, harvested, processed, and stored. Animals require feeding, herding, and protection. Agricultural work can consume enormous amounts of time during critical seasons. A failed harvest threatens months of accumulated effort at once. Drought, pests, floods, or disease can devastate crops across an entire community. Yet agriculture offers advantages powerful enough to keep expanding. Stored grain provides food beyond the harvest season. Surplus can support people who are not directly producing food. Population density allows communities to defend territory, organize large projects, and maintain specialized crafts. Domesticated animals eventually provide not only meat but milk, fiber, traction, manure, and transportation in different regions. The landscape becomes increasingly engineered around human needs. Storage also creates something more socially disruptive: concentrated wealth. Grain can be counted. Herds can be owned. Fields can be inherited or controlled. Surplus can be collected, exchanged, given away, or taken. The evidence for prehistoric property systems is difficult to interpret, and not every farming community becomes strongly unequal. Some maintain remarkably egalitarian arrangements for long periods. But agriculture creates material conditions under which inequality can become more durable. Houses begin reflecting these changes. In some settlements, structures become larger or more differentiated. Storage areas move inside domestic spaces, potentially increasing household control over food. Burials sometimes reveal unequal access to valued objects. Later genetic evidence can expose differences in mobility between men and women, or patterns of descent connected to particular communities. None of these signals alone proves a rigid hierarchy, but together they show social organization becoming increasingly complex. Humans are also transforming the environment on a new scale. Forests are cleared, wetlands are drained or modified, soils are repeatedly disturbed, grazing animals change vegetation. Fire opens land for cultivation. Certain species flourish because people protect them while others retreat. What began as small patches of managed vegetation becomes a widening human-made ecological system. And yet the most surprising development is not simply that people farm, it is what they begin building together. Some communities gather for projects requiring coordination far beyond an individual household. Stone is quarried, transported, carved, and raised. Ceremonial spaces appear whose construction demands substantial labor. The old assumption that monuments require kings, bureaucracies, and cities begins to unravel when archaeologists uncover monumental architecture among communities standing close to the threshold between foraging and farming. Before the first written rulers claim credit for temples and walls, people with no known kings and no written administration are already organizing themselves to move enormous stones. The question is no longer whether prehistoric communities could build monuments. It is what those monuments reveal about the societies that existed before kingdoms. On a limestone ridge in southeastern Anatolia, massive pillars rise from circular and oval enclosures built thousands of years before Stonehenge and long before the pyramids of Egypt. Some of the stones stand several meters high and weigh many tons. Their surfaces carry carved foxes, snakes, boars, birds, gazelles, and other animals, while several pillars possess stylized arms, hands, belts, and clothing, suggesting that the stones themselves may represent human-like beings. The site is Göbekli Tepe, and its earliest monumental structures date to roughly the 10th millennium BCE, close to the profound transition between late hunter-gatherer lifeways and the emerging agricultural societies of Southwest Asia. Its discovery did not reveal the world's first religion, or solve the origin of civilization as popular claims sometimes suggest. What it did reveal was more important large-scale communal construction could emerge in societies far earlier than older models had expected. The builders have no known writing system. There is no surviving royal inscription ordering workers to quarry stone. No administrative tablets record food distributed to laborers. No palace identifies a king who commands the project. The communities associated with the site inhabit a region where hunting and gathering remain important, even as cultivation and eventually domestication develop. Somehow, people organize enough labor to extract limestone-shape pillars, transport them, construct enclosures, obtain food, and return to these spaces repeatedly. How that labor is coordinated remains uncertain. Popular descriptions sometimes imagine enormous workforces dragging impossibly heavy stones over great distances, but much of the limestone is locally available, and experimental archaeology suggests that prehistoric communities can move substantial stones without technologies usually associated with later states. The mystery is therefore not supernatural engineering. It is social organization. People have reasons powerful enough to cooperate on projects that provide no obvious direct food return. Those reasons may involve ritual, communal identity, feasting, remembrance, social competition, or relationships between groups gathering periodically at important places. Animal bones recovered at Göbekli Tepe indicate substantial consumption of wild species, and large gatherings may have involved shared meals. Yet scholars still debate how the enclosures functioned, and whether distinctions between sacred and domestic space are as clear as early interpretations implied. Archaeology rarely provides labels for prehistoric institutions. Göbekli Tepe is also no longer isolated as a strange exception. Research across the wider region has identified other early sites with monumental or symbolically elaborate architecture, showing that communities in Upper Mesopotamia were experimenting with substantial communal buildings during this transformative period. The broader pattern weakens any simple argument that one extraordinary site single-handedly caused agriculture or civilization. Instead, monumental construction appears within a landscape already undergoing deep economic and social change. This matters because an older model placed monuments near the end of a chain. Agriculture supposedly creates surplus. Surplus supports specialists and rulers. Rulers organize labor. Organized labor builds temples. The archaeological evidence suggests the relationship can work in several directions. Collective ritual and large gatherings may themselves encourage greater food production, because people need reliable supplies for workers and feasts. Social commitments can influence economic change rather than merely resulting from it. Thousands of kilometers away and thousands of years later, other societies demonstrate again that monumentality does not belong exclusively to centralized states. At Stonehenge in southern Britain, construction unfolds through multiple phases beginning around 5,000 years ago. The monument eventually incorporates enormous sarsen stones and smaller bluestones, some transported over remarkable distances. Stonehenge belongs to farming communities rather than hunter-gatherers, but it still predates writing in Britain and offers no inscription explaining who designed it or why. The landscape around it shows that the monument cannot be understood as an isolated ring of stones. Burial mounds, avenues, settlements, timber structures, and other features connect Stonehenge to a broader ceremonial landscape. Evidence from nearby Durrington walls indicates large gatherings and feasting. Animal remains suggest that pigs were brought from distant parts of Britain, implying networks capable of drawing people together across substantial distances. The monument's astronomical alignments, especially with solstitial sunrise and sunset directions, are real and significant, but they have also encouraged extravagant theories. Claims involving lost super-civilizations, extraterrestrial engineers, or forgotten technologies are unsupported. Prehistoric builders do not need impossible knowledge to observe the horizon carefully over generations. The more interesting fact is that communities without writing can preserve and transmit sophisticated practical and cosmological knowledge through teaching, repetition, ritual, and collective memory. Similar caution applies to other prehistoric monuments. Megalithic tombs, standing stones, earthworks, ceremonial enclosures, and large settlements appear in many parts of the world at different times. They do not represent one global civilization or a single, lost architectural tradition. Their similarities often arise because human societies repeatedly confront comparable problems, honoring ancestors, marking territory, coordinating groups, observing seasonal cycles, displaying collective power, and creating durable places in landscapes otherwise filled with temporary human lives. Building in stone changes memory. A story told orally survives only while people continue telling it. A monument can remain after the generation that built it dies. Later communities may reinterpret it, rebuild it, bury their dead beside it, or forget its original purpose entirely. Some monuments remain active for centuries, accumulating meanings their first builders could never have anticipated. This creates a peculiar archaeological problem. The final visible structure may combine several different historical moments. A stone circle can be modified. A tomb can be reopened. A ceremonial building can be deliberately filled in. New structures can be erected over older ones. Archaeologists must separate these phases carefully, rather than assuming everything visible belonged to one grand original plan. The effort invested in monuments also reveals something about surplus without requiring a tax bureaucracy. Workers need food while quarrying and building. Tools must be manufactured. Skilled knowledge must be shared. Seasonal scheduling may be necessary so construction does not interfere catastrophically with harvesting or hunting. Communities therefore coordinate time as well as labor. Yet monumental cooperation does not necessarily mean permanent hierarchy. A project could be organized by respected elders, ritual specialists, households, temporary leaders, kin groups or institutions for which there is no modern equivalent. Authority can exist without kingship. Leadership can be situational rather than hereditary. The evidence remains incomplete because architecture preserves the outcome of organization more readily than the rules behind it. What these sites demonstrate most clearly is that prehistoric societies are capable of collective imagination on an enormous scale. People can transform landscapes because they share ideas about places, ancestors, seasons, animals, or powers that cannot be measured simply in calories. Symbolic worlds first glimpsed in caves are becoming architectural. Meaning is no longer painted only onto stone, it is built from stone. Around many such communities, meanwhile, settlement itself is changing. Houses cluster more densely. Storage increases, crafts become specialized, exchange networks widen. Some villages remain relatively equal, while others begin revealing stronger differences in wealth and authority. The monument is not yet the city, but the ability to gather labor, manage resources, and create enduring public spaces points toward a new scale of human organization. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, villages are becoming something larger. As villages grow, they begin to change the meaning of proximity. In a small settlement, most people may know one another directly. Kinship memory and face-to-face obligation can organize much of daily life. But when hundreds or thousands of people begin living within the same broad community, older systems are stretched. Paths become streets. Houses crowd together, storage expands, work becomes more specialized, disputes become harder to settle informally. The settlement is no longer simply a collection of households, it begins to behave like a larger social organism whose survival depends on coordination at a scale earlier communities rarely had to sustain. One of the clearest examples appears at Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia, occupied for centuries beginning in the 7th millennium BCE. The settlement contains densely packed mud brick houses built directly against one another with access often through openings in the roofs, rather than ordinary ground-level streets. From above, the settlement would have looked almost like a continuous architectural surface, broken by courtyards, work areas, and rooftop movement. People live, cook, work, bury their dead, repair walls, and rebuild houses within a tightly compressed environment. Çatalhöyük was once described as an early city in the modern sense, but later research has complicated that picture. It lacks many features associated with later urban states such as obvious palaces, monumental administrative buildings, or clear evidence for a centralized ruling class. Its significance lies precisely in this ambiguity. Thousands of people can live in close proximity without leaving evidence for kings or bureaucrats. Dense settlement does not automatically produce the political structure of later cities. Households appear to carry enormous importance. Floors are repeatedly replastered. Some buildings contain elaborate wall paintings, installations, animal horns, and burials beneath platforms. Certain houses are rebuilt again and again in nearly the same location, suggesting strong connections between buildings' memory and social identity. The dead remain physically inside the settlement under the spaces where the living continue ordinary life. Ancestry is not confined to a distant cemetery. It is embedded in architecture. This intimacy produces problems as well as continuity. Dense settlements create waste. Smoke from hearths accumulates. Animals kept nearby increase sanitation challenges. Parasites and infectious disease can spread more efficiently when people live closely together. Archaeological evidence from early large settlements often shows that urban-like concentration brings health costs long before formal cities appear. Human beings gain security, exchange, and social opportunity through density, while simultaneously creating new biological risks. The economic benefits can be substantial. A large settlement supports craftspeople who spend more time producing particular goods. Stoneworking, pottery, basketry, textile production, woodworking, food, processing, and ritual activities can become increasingly specialized. Specialization does not necessarily mean full-time professions, but repeated practice creates expertise. A person who makes hundreds of stone blades will usually become better at it than someone producing only a few. Obsidian provides a striking example. Volcanic glass from sources in Anatolia travels across wide regions of the Near East. Its sharp fracture makes it valuable for tools, but its distribution also reveals communication between communities. Materials can move through many exchanges before reaching their destination. A blade found far from its source therefore records not only technology but relationships. The object has crossed a human landscape before entering the archaeological one. Trade expands in other materials as well. Shells move inland from coasts. Certain pigments travel long distances. Fine stone, timber, animal products, and eventually metals pass between communities. The exact mechanisms vary. Some exchange may occur between relatives. Some goods may accompany seasonal gatherings or marriages. Others may move through increasingly specialized networks. Calling all of this commerce risks imposing modern assumptions, yet people are clearly learning how to maintain connections across regions larger than a single settlement's immediate territory. Those connections can become essential during crisis. A community suffering crop failure may depend on neighbors. Marriage partners from other settlements strengthen alliances. Knowledge about new tools or crops spreads through networks. At the same time, valuable routes can become sources of rivalry. Control over a quarry, river, crossing fertile plain or mountain pass may increase a community's influence. Defensive architecture begins appearing in some prehistoric settlements, though interpreting it is rarely straightforward. Walls may protect against raiders, animals, flooding, or several dangers at once. Jericho in the Jordan Valley contains an extraordinary early stone wall and tower, dating to the pre-pottery Neolithic, long before the urban kingdoms familiar from later biblical history. The purpose of the tower remains debated. It may have had defensive, communal, symbolic, or practical functions. The evidence refuses a single easy answer. Conflict itself becomes increasingly visible as populations grow. Skeletal injuries, fortified settlements, projectile points embedded in bones, and occasional mass burials demonstrate that prehistoric violence can be serious. Yet there is no reason to imagine constant warfare. Some large communities endure for centuries with little evidence of organized combat. Others experience episodes of violence separated by long periods of coexistence. Human social complexity produces both cooperation and conflict, often at the same time. Food storage sits at the center of this transformation. Surplus makes specialization possible because not every person must obtain food every day. It can support builders, craftspeople, ritual specialists or leaders. But whoever manages surplus gains potential influence. Communal storage can strengthen collective security. Household storage can strengthen family autonomy. Centralized storage can create opportunities for political control. Archaeologists study the location and scale of storage facilities because where food is kept can reveal something about who controls it. Inequality begins to leave subtle traces. Some graves contain more elaborate goods than others. Certain houses are larger or more carefully constructed. Exotic materials appear disproportionately in specific contexts. Differences in childhood nutrition can sometimes be detected chemically in skeletons. None of these clues should be interpreted automatically as evidence for rigid social classes, because prestige ritual roles, age, and family identity can produce differences without permanent hierarchy. Still, repeated patterns suggest that wealth and status are becoming more difficult to distribute evenly in some communities. Population growth magnifies every challenge. More people require more land, water, fuel, food, and building material. Forests near settlements may be cut heavily. Fields lose fertility if poorly managed. Livestock compete for grazing. Water systems require maintenance. A settlement that grows successfully can become dependent on a larger surrounding territory just to sustain itself. That dependency encourages organization beyond individual households. Irrigation channels must be dug and repaired in some environments. Fields require boundaries. Herds need routes. Grain must be measured. Labor must be coordinated. Disputes need resolution. Ritual calendars may help synchronize activities. Leadership that was once temporary may become more permanent when problems themselves become permanent. Still, the path towards cities is not inevitable. Some large settlements shrink or disappear. Others fragment into smaller villages. Communities can reject hierarchy, relocate when resources decline, or reorganize their social systems. Prehistory contains abandoned experiments as well as successful ones. The settlements that eventually lead toward urban life are only one branch among many possibilities, but in several regions that branch continues growing. Villages become towns, towns become regional centers. Surplus moves farther. Crafts become more specialized. Public buildings grow larger. Administrative systems begin to appear. Human beings are approaching a threshold where thousands of strangers can live inside the same political and economic network. The city has not fully arrived yet, but its foundations are already visible in the crowded houses, storage rooms, exchange routes, walls, workshops, and increasingly unequal spaces of the late prehistoric world. By the time settlements begin drawing resources from entire surrounding regions, the old village economy is under pressure to become something more organized. A few hundred people can often manage shared work through kinship, custom, and direct negotiation. Several thousand people living together create different problems. Water must arrive where it is needed. Food must continue entering the settlement even when many inhabitants no longer produce it themselves. Buildings require timber reeds, clay, or stone from surrounding landscapes. Potters need fuel. Craftspeople need raw materials. Herds need grazing land. Farmers need access to fields. The larger a settlement becomes, the more dependent it is on systems extending beyond the houses visible at its center. In southern Mesopotamia, this challenge becomes especially important. The landscape between the Tigris and Euphrates and their shifting branches contains extraordinarily fertile alluvial soils, but farming there depends heavily on water management. Rainfall is limited, and rivers do not conveniently flood according to human schedules. Communities dig channels, redirect water, maintain embankments, and organize cultivation across increasingly engineered landscapes. Irrigation does not automatically create kings or states, as older theories sometimes implied, but it does encourage cooperation and administration. When water systems become large and interconnected, maintenance is relentless. A canal that fills with sediment becomes useless. An embankment neglected at the wrong moment can fail. Too little water destroys crops. Too much can do the same. Upstream decisions affect people downstream. Fields need boundaries and labor has to be mobilized at particular times. These practical demands create opportunities for institutions capable of coordinating work beyond a single household. Surplus grain becomes central because it is both food and a form of stored possibility. It can feed builders, potters, traders, religious specialists, administrators, and others whose work does not produce immediate calories. It can support people during bad harvests. It can be exchanged for materials unavailable locally. It can also be demanded as tribute or obligation. Once surplus begins moving through institutions, rather than remaining entirely within households, economic organization changes fundamentally. Temples and other communal institutions become important in several early urbanizing societies, although their exact economic and political roles vary across time and place. Large buildings require organized labor and repeated maintenance. Their presence suggests communities capable of concentrating resources. Religious authority, economic management, and political power may overlap rather than existing as separate categories, recognizable to a modern observer. Craft specialization deepens within these growing centers. Pottery can be produced in larger quantities and more standardized forms. Metalworking becomes increasingly important where access to copper and other materials permits it. Textile production may absorb enormous amounts of labor while leaving less spectacular archaeological remains than stone architecture. Spindle whorls loom, weights, impressions, and occasional preserved fibers hint at an industry that could become economically crucial. The dependence on distant materials is striking. Southern Mesopotamia possesses mud and reeds in abundance, but lacks many resources desired by expanding communities. Good building stone quality timber and metal ores must often come from elsewhere. Exchange networks therefore stretch toward Anatolia, the Iranian plateau, the Persian Gulf and regions beyond. Boats move along rivers and coastal waters. Pack animals carry goods overland. Materials travel hundreds or thousands of kilometers through networks connecting societies that may never share a political ruler. Long-distance exchange is not new, but its scale changes. A rare shell carried between hunter-gatherer communities can express social connection. An urbanizing economy may require regular supplies of raw material for entire industries. Reliability becomes more important. Routes become economically strategic. Merchants or institutional agents may acquire specialized roles. Measures and accounting systems become increasingly valuable because memory alone struggles to manage growing quantities of goods and obligations. Before full writing appears, people experiment with ways to record information materially. In the ancient Near East, small clay tokens have been interpreted as part of developing systems for representing quantities and commodities, although scholars continue debating the exact pathways connecting such devices to later writing. Sealed containers, impressions, numerical signs, and administrative markings gradually create a world in which information can exist outside the human mind. This is a profound shift. Oral memory is powerful, especially in societies trained to preserve knowledge through repetition, but an expanding economy generates countless details. Who delivered grain, how much was stored, which animals belonged to whom, what labor was owed, and what goods entered a central facility can overwhelm purely personal recollection. Administrative technologies allow obligations to survive the absence or death of the person who remembers them. Power changes along with record keeping. A respected leader in a small community may depend heavily on persuasion and personal relationships. Institutions controlling storage, labor, ritual spaces, or information can survive individual leaders. Authority becomes embedded in buildings, procedures, offices, and systems. The foundations of the state begin to emerge not simply because one ambitious person seizes control, but because increasingly complex societies create positions from which control can be exercised. Conflict also changes scale. Agricultural land represents accumulated labor. Irrigation systems cannot simply be abandoned without cost. Stored food can be seized. Trade routes can be controlled. Larger populations provide more potential fighters, while fortifications become increasingly substantial in some regions. Yet warfare is only one mechanism driving political consolidation. Cooperation can be equally powerful. Communities may unite to manage water conduct rituals, exchange goods, or protect shared resources. Environmental pressures complicate this process. Irrigation can gradually damage soil when salts accumulate under certain conditions, especially in arid regions. Deforestation may make timber harder to obtain. Overgrazing can degrade vegetation. Rivers change course naturally, leaving settlements suddenly distant from waterways on which they depend. Drought can destabilize food production. The earliest complex societies therefore inherit a pattern that will recur throughout recorded history. The systems that allow populations to grow can also create new vulnerabilities. No single formula produces civilization. Egypt develops around the Nile under ecological conditions very different from southern Mesopotamia. The Indus region follows another path. Early complex societies in China, the Andes, Mesoamerica, and elsewhere emerge from distinct combinations of agriculture, trade ritual, environmental management, and political organization. Similar outcomes do not require identical causes. Even the word civilization can mislead if it suggests that people outside cities are somehow less fully human or socially sophisticated. Prehistoric hunter-gatherers, pastoralists, farmers, and villagers possess complex cultures of their own. What is changing is not humanity's intelligence, but the scale and structure of organization. More people are being connected through systems that extend beyond direct personal relationships. By the 4th millennium BCE, in parts of Mesopotamia, settlements such as Uruk grow to unprecedented dimensions. Monumental precincts rise, specialized production expands, administrative devices multiply, networks reach far beyond the city's immediate surroundings. Something recognizably urban has emerged. Yet one final barrier still separates this world from what is conventionally called history. Its administrators can count goods, seal containers, mark ownership, and preserve information through increasingly sophisticated symbols, but eventually those marks begin doing something even more powerful. They start representing language. The world before recorded history is approaching its own boundary. At first, the marks are not trying to tell stories. They do not describe heroic battles, explain creation, preserve the thoughts of philosophers, or record the private lives of ordinary families. Many of the earliest surviving written signs are concerned with something far more practical: quantities, goods, labor, institutions, and administration. Grain must be counted. Animals must be tracked. Containers need identification. Deliveries must be remembered after the people who witnessed them have gone home. In the expanding settlements of late 4th millennium BCE Mesopotamia, the pressure to manage information helps produce one of the most consequential technologies in human history: Marks impressed and drawn onto clay become increasingly systematic until information is no longer preserved only in human memory. Writing begins to open the narrow doorway through which prehistory becomes recorded history. The transition is gradual. Before recognizable writing communities across the ancient Near East used seals, tokens, impressions, numerical signs, and other devices to organize economic information. Exactly how these systems relate to the emergence of writing remains debated, and scholars caution against imagining a single straight evolutionary sequence. What survives suggests repeated experimentation with ways of turning quantities and categories into durable visual signs. Clay is particularly suited to the task in Mesopotamia. It is abundant, inexpensive, and easily shaped while wet. A small tablet can receive marks quickly. If dried, it can survive for a useful period. If accidentally or deliberately fired, it can endure for thousands of years. The very material chosen for routine administration eventually becomes one of archaeology's greatest archives. At Uruk and other sites, late 4th millennium tablets contain signs associated with commodities, numbers, institutions, and economic transactions. These earliest texts remain difficult to interpret completely. The script is still developing, and many signs do not correspond neatly to the later cuneiform system. Scholars understand more fully. But gradually writing becomes capable of representing not merely things and numbers, but elements of spoken language. This changes almost everything about the evidence available to later historians. Before writing, archaeologists reconstruct identity indirectly from houses, burials, tools, diet, DNA, and landscapes. After writing, names begin appearing. Titles survive. Institutions identify themselves. Transactions preserve relationships between individuals. Eventually, rulers announce achievements. Priests record offerings. Legal decisions are written down. Myths are copied. Letters travel between courts, and people complain about debts, work, property, and one another. Yet the arrival of writing does not illuminate society evenly. Early literacy is limited. Most people still leave no personal written testimony. Administrative and elite institutions are disproportionately visible because they produce and preserve texts. A farmer whose grain is recorded on a tablet may appear only as a name or obligation. Laborers who build monumental architecture may remain anonymous, while the ruler receives credit. Written history is richer than prehistory in one sense, but it introduces biases of its own. Mesopotamia is not the only place where writing develops. In Egypt, early hieroglyphic writing appears around the end of the 4th millennium BCE, within the context of growing political complexity and state formation. Labels, inscriptions, and administrative materials begin attaching names and identities to objects and rulers. The Egyptian system develops along its own trajectory, and debate continues over the relationship between early writing traditions in Egypt and Mesopotamia. What is clear is that by the early dynastic period, written signs have become deeply connected to kingship, administration, ritual, and memory. Other regions cross the threshold at different times and in different ways. The Indus civilization later develops a system of signs found on seals, tablets, pottery, and other objects. Because the Indus script remains undeciphered and surviving inscriptions are generally short, its relationship to spoken language and its precise functions remain subjects of debate. The civilization is highly urban, with sophisticated settlements and far-reaching trade, yet its surviving signs still resist confident reading. In China, securely attested, mature writing appears much later on oracle bones and bronze inscriptions during the Shang period, though researchers continue investigating earlier symbols and possible precursors. In Mesoamerica, writing develops independently within a completely different cultural history. These examples matter because they show that writing is not an automatic consequence of agriculture or cities. Complex societies can exist for long periods without it, while systems of recording information arise under different social pressures. Nor does writing spread instantly once invented. Vast regions remain prehistoric in the technical archaeological sense, long after literate civilizations flourish elsewhere. A Roman or Mesopotamian scribe may live at the same time as communities thousands of kilometers away, whose histories are still transmitted entirely without writing. Prehistory, therefore, does not end on one global date. Its boundary moves unevenly across the planet. That unevenness exposes a weakness in the phrase recorded history. A society can be described by outsiders before producing its own written records. In such cases, the surviving account may reflect the assumptions, prejudices, and political interests of foreign observers. Archaeology remains essential even when texts exist because material evidence can contradict what writers claimed or reveal people those writers ignored. The deeper archaeological past also refuses to become irrelevant simply because writing arrives. The first cities inherit crops domesticated over thousands of years. Their populations carry genetic histories shaped by migrations and interbreeding stretching deep into prehistory. Their gods' rituals, social practices, and oral traditions may contain elements far older than the earliest surviving texts, although proving specific lines of continuity is often difficult. Written civilization is built on foundations whose builders left no names. By the 3rd millennium BCE, monumental states are becoming unmistakable in several regions. In Egypt, royal power concentrates resources on a scale eventually capable of producing the Great Pyramid complexes. In Mesopotamia, competing city-states organize temples, palaces, irrigation, warfare, and trade. Writing becomes increasingly versatile. The ancient world familiar from schoolbooks begins to emerge. But from the perspective of the full human story, this is astonishingly late. Hundreds of thousands of years separate the earliest Homo sapiens from the first substantial written archives. Nearly every fundamental adaptation that allows humans to inhabit the planet is older than writing. Fire-use complex hunting clothing, seafaring long-distance migration art music, ritual, domestication, farming, permanent settlement, monumental construction, and extensive exchange networks all develop in worlds without historical documents. Even cities begin before their inhabitants leave texts capable of explaining them clearly. The threshold of written history is therefore less like sunrise than a narrow beam of light entering an enormous dark landscape. The first tablets illuminate particular rooms, while almost everything beyond them remains shadowed. They tell us that grain moved, officials counted, rulers governed, and institutions endured. They do not suddenly reveal the millions of lives that came before, and behind those first written names stretches a human world almost unimaginably larger than the surviving record-drowned coastlines, forgotten languages, migrations known only from DNA settlements, buried beneath later cities, songs that disappeared with their singers and entire peoples whose existence may still be waiting beneath the ground. The first written tablets do not close the prehistoric world behind them. They simply place a thin line of light across it. Beyond that line, enormous portions of humanity remain difficult to see. Written records begin in a few regions at particular moments for particular purposes, while elsewhere people continue living without writing for centuries or millennia. Even within literate societies, most individuals leave no written testimony. The boundary between prehistory and history is therefore not a clean doorway. It is more like a coastline advancing and retreating according to what evidence survives. What makes the world before recorded history so difficult to understand is also what makes it extraordinary. Nearly everything humans do during this immense period must be reconstructed indirectly. A migration can survive as a genetic pattern. A meal can survive as charred seeds. A hunting event can survive as cuts on bone. A journey can survive through stone transported far from its geological source. A changing climate can survive in layers of ice pollen, lake sediments, cave deposits, and ancient soils. A social relationship can sometimes be inferred from the way people bury their dead. An entire coastline can survive only as a submerged geological surface beneath the sea. Each fragment is small. Together they form something astonishingly large. Consider the scale of movement alone. Humans originating in Africa eventually occupy almost every major terrestrial environment. They enter forests, deserts, mountains, islands, grasslands, tundra, and Arctic coastlines. They cross water barriers. They survive periods of extreme cold and rapid warming. They repeatedly encounter unfamiliar plants and animals and learn how to exploit them. Some populations disappear, others merge. Some leave descendants whose genomes still carry traces of ancient encounters. The result is not a straight migration across an empty planet, it is a web. Populations separate and reconnect. Technologies spread between groups that may remain genetically distinct. Languages change and disappear. Traditions persist in altered forms. Landscapes divide communities and later reconnect them. Climate can open a corridor for a few thousand years and close it again. A route that seems obvious on a modern map may have been impossible during an ice age, while a region now separated by ocean may once have been an accessible plain. This is why geography must be treated as part of human history. The Earth itself is never a passive background. Glaciers reshape valleys, rivers abandon channels, volcanoes bury landscapes, forests advance and retreat, deserts expand and contract, seas rise over ancient plains, tectonic forces lift some landscapes while lowering others. Human communities continually respond to these changes, but they also alter the environments around them through burning, hunting, cultivation, grazing construction, and water management. By the beginning of recorded history, humans have already become one of the planet's most influential species. Yet the process has not been driven by one technological breakthrough. It is cumulative. A child learning which plants are edible inherits knowledge from countless earlier generations. A hunter reading tracks relies on observations accumulated over centuries. A farmer cultivating grain participates in an evolutionary relationship that began with people collecting wild plants. A builder raising a monument inherits traditions of stone-working cooperation, measurement, and ritual organization that developed long before anyone could write instructions down. Even civilization itself has deep roots in experiments that never become civilizations. The village that disappears after a few centuries is not necessarily a failed version of a city. It may represent a social system that worked for its inhabitants and was later abandoned because climate, resources, conflict, or cultural priorities changed. A settlement beneath the sea is not less significant because it never produced a palace. A small community preserving a local tradition may contribute just as much to the human story as a later empire whose rulers leave thousands of inscriptions. The word civilization can therefore hide as much as it reveals. It often draws attention towards cities, states, monumental architecture, writing, and centralized power. But the overwhelming majority of human existence occurs outside those structures. For hundreds of thousands of years, people build lives without kings, bureaucracies, or written laws. They raise children, teach skills, make tools, prepare food, care for the injured, mourn the dead, form friendships, exchange gifts, tell stories, create music, and interpret the world around them. Most of these actions leave almost no durable archaeological trace. This is perhaps the greatest mystery of all. Archaeology can tell where a fire burned, but not exactly what people said around it. It can identify pigments on a cave wall, but rarely recover the story behind the image. It can determine that a body was buried deliberately, but not what the mourners believed about death. It can recover DNA from an ancient individual, but not the person's memories, fears, ambitions, or sense of belonging. The evidence remains incomplete, and the uncertainty should not be mistaken for failure. The missing pieces are part of the nature of deep time. Organic materials decay, coastlines disappear, oral traditions end, languages die, populations are absorbed, later settlements destroy earlier ones. Natural processes continually erase the traces that archaeology tries to recover, and yet the surviving evidence is enough to overturn the oldest misconception about prehistory, that it is an empty waiting room before real history begins. It is almost the opposite. The written age occupies a tiny fraction of the human story. Before the first tablet, there are already people capable of crossing oceans, surviving glaciers, creating art, organizing large gatherings, managing landscapes, exchanging materials across enormous distances, caring for vulnerable members of their communities, and adapting to environmental changes that would challenge any society. There are already networks, traditions, identities, technologies, and conflicts. There are already losses and recoveries, migrations and returns, innovations and forgotten experiments. The people of prehistory do not know that one day their world will be called prehistory. They have no reason to imagine that future scholars will divide their existence into periods based on the survival of writing. They simply live within their present, as people always do, unaware that the landscape around them will eventually become evidence. A hunter walking across an Ice Age plain cannot know that the animal tracks beneath his feet will one day be compared with genetic evidence from another continent. A family living beside a vanished river cannot know that rising seas will cover their settlement. A person pressing pigment against a cave wall cannot know that thousands of years later, strangers will stand beneath electric lights and try to understand the image. They are not leaving a record for us. They are simply living. And perhaps that is why the world before recorded history remains so compelling. It is not a story of people waiting to become modern. It is the story of people already being fully human in worlds that no longer exist. The first written words eventually give humanity a new way to remember, but they arrive after almost everything has already happened. By the time the earliest scribes press their signs into wet clay, countless generations have crossed landscapes that have since disappeared. They have watched glaciers advance and retreat, followed animals across changing plains, gathered beside rivers, crossed narrow seas, built homes, buried their dead, and passed knowledge from one generation to another without leaving a written sentence behind. Much of that world is gone now. Some of it lies beneath modern cities. Some rests under forests, deserts, lakes, and oceans. Some survives only in fragments of bone or stone. Some remains inside the DNA of people living today. And some has disappeared so completely that even the shape of what was lost can no longer be known. The silence can feel enormous, but it is not empty. Every surviving fragment carries a trace of a life that once seemed ordinary to the person living it. A hearth was once warmth. A stone blade was once a useful tool. A shell was once something beautiful enough to carry. A buried body was once someone known and remembered. A footprint was once simply the mark left behind by a person walking home. Time has changed the meaning of all these things. The modern world often feels permanent because its roads, cities, borders, buildings, and archives surround people with evidence of continuity. Prehistory offers a humbler perspective. Landscapes change, coastlines disappear, languages vanish, communities dissolve. Even civilizations that seem immovable eventually become layers beneath something newer. And still human life continues. That may be the quietest lesson of the ancient world. Survival is not always dramatic. It is often the accumulation of ordinary choices made by people who cannot see the future. Where to camp, what to eat, which path to follow, when to move, what to preserve, whom to care for, which knowledge to teach a child. Across immense spans of time, those choices become migrations, cultures, settlements, agriculture, cities, and eventually written history. But beneath every written name are countless unnamed lives. Their world has disappeared, yet the traces remain: a stone beneath the soil, a buried shoreline beneath dark water, a fragment of ancient DNA, a faint pigment on a cave wall, a seed preserved in ash. And somewhere beneath the landscapes of the present, more traces are still waiting. Not necessarily a lost empire or a forgotten city, but something quieter. A place where someone once stood. A place where someone once watched the fire go dark. A place where, for one brief moment in the enormous history of the earth, a human being was simply there.